Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Eric Siron back on the show, and we're going to be talking about kind of those historical protections the community has come up with to help safeguard backups against ransomware. So we're going to be talking about removable media, air gapping, dedicated service accounts, application whitelisting, and we're going to be talking about all those things from the perspective of a threat actor going after backups and ultimately why those solutions don't tend to work when they're used in a vacuum, right? So we've got that, a lot of commentary, and much more coming up on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. All right, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got a returning guest. We haven't seen him for a while, but I got a returning guest on the show. I got Eric Siron. How's it going, Eric?
Doing well. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. Hey, it's been a while since we've had you on the show, so just in case any of our listeners don't know who you are, can you give us a quick introduction, Eric?
Yeah, real quick. So I've been in the IT industry for about 25 years now. I worked with small businesses all the way up to a 20,000 user healthcare organization. And I focus my efforts on the smaller businesses that I believe are not really heard in the industry.
Right. I know you spend a lot of time in the SMB space, and like you also mentioned your 20,000 user healthcare organization. So I know you've seen a lot of different organizations and size of organizations. You've seen a lot of stuff throughout your career, right? And I know one area that you focus on is backup and recovery, right? You have actually authored a couple editions of the backup Bible for us, if I remember correctly, right? What are we on, like second or third edition now? I don't remember which.
Second, and then they split out with the ransomware edition. So I guess
That's right. That's right. So folks,
publications.
yeah. So in case you guys aren't aware of that, folks, Eric has put together a fantastic ebook a couple of times now, like I said, for us, called the Backup Bible. And really, it's a vendor agnostic resource that helps take aspiring IT professionals or even seasoned IT professionals from I don't know anything about backup to, I'm feeling pretty good about myself when it comes to backup technologies, right? That's kind of the goal of that piece of content. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes. So be sure to check that out. But we are kind of having a backup and recovery conversation today, Eric. And you and I have had this conversation over beer and coffee before, not at the same time, because that would be weird. I guess there's some people that like beer with coffee. That'd be kind of weird. But anyway, well, this is a conversation you and I have had a couple of times. And what I wanted to focus on in this episode is there are all of these quote unquote backup protections that we have as an industry come up with over the years to combat ransomware, right? I mean, some of these, you read through some forums and some people would say like, oh, hey, this is the magic silver bullet against ransomware. You do this and you'll never have a problem. One, I have a problem with that statement because there's when it comes to security, there's not ever one magic silver bullet, right? You always need a multi-layered approach, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to get there. But I wanted to step through some of those common protections that the industry says you should do for protecting your backups against ransomware and kind of talk about why they don't work. In fact, I just did a short webinar. It was like 30 minutes, 35 minutes last week. And that's what gave me this idea like, okay, I felt rushed through a 35 minute webinar trying to cover this discussion. I'm like, this would be a really good podcast episode. So I want to start with probably the most common one I see, right? And everybody's if you're in any IT communities online, you've probably come across one of these people that like, well, you know what? I got my backups, my tapes or my backup drives. They're sitting on the shelf over there. You can't ransom them if they're not online, right? Everybody has seen one of those posts probably. I have a problem with that. So first off, I will concede offline media can't be ransomware. It can, right? I do agree with that part. But here is where I have a problem. Unless you have bottomless pockets and you're only ever going to write to a disk one time, it's going to get connected again at some point, right? It's going to get connected again at some point. And if I'm a threat actor, uh, and I am incentivized enough to get into your organization, I have enough resources and time to do so, I'm probably going to get into your organization in some way, shape, or form. Right. And I mean, there's a number of different vectors of attack, right? I could use phishing. I'm probably going to end up on your network as a standard user account at some point. I'm going to work on privilege escalation until I have access to your backup storage in some way, shape, or form. And as a threat actor, I'm probably going to know that people use drive rotations for their backups. And if it were me, I would probably sit and wait for a few weeks until I got a good understanding of what your rotation media looks like. How frequently is it changed? When is it changed? When do the backups run? And it's not very difficult for me to set up a cleverly disguised scheduled task somewhere, or heck, I mean, even if I knew that, okay, Eric changes the drive at 2 a.m. or I don't know, 11 p.m. every night. Okay, I'm going to log in at maybe 3 a.m. when the backups are done, and I'm going to ransom this disk. You know, it's not outside the realm of possibility. And that is why I don't buy the offline media quote unquote protection. And the same applies to tape, right? Because I mean, tape storage is accessible at some point in time as well, right? So, I mean, that's my thoughts. What are your thoughts with this particular area, Eric?
Before I answer that, I need to preamble this
Smart man.
because I vividly remember 20 something years ago when they came out and said, you know, if you put your money in a savings account, the interest doesn't stay ahead of inflation. So you're going to lose money. You need to invest it. And what people heard was, I don't need to save my money. So I want to make it very clear what we're saying is you still need to take your media offline. You still need to take the precautions we're
Yes.
talking about. But if you are banking on these individual items to protect you from ransomware, that is what we want you to. That's not going to happen.
That's an important
So
distinction.
you need to take your media offline. It's not going to be the silver bullet against ransomware. Okay.
And
So
that's where we're
let's
going to come back and
make that
talk.
very clear. Yes. So, but everything you said, I mean, and let's add one more component that threat actors know you're using backup products and they can
Yep.
gamble sometimes and say you're probably using this one or that one. And if not, it's not hard to figure out which one you're using because they, you know, the backup vendor certainly wants to advertise everywhere.
Yep.
So they'll say, oh, you're targeting this one. So guess what? We'll wait for that service to start. We'll find out where that service is running. We'll do this. We'll do that. We will watch for that specific item and we'll compromise that. So data in, data out, whatever.
Yep.
Right. So absolutely 100%. Taking it offline is great, but at some point you do have to feed the media in or out. And if you're really disciplined and you have the money, say you know your restoration should always take place in a clean room,
Yep.
so that the backup media that you're trying to restore from to the best of your ability never touches a live system again. But it's just like you said, are you really going to go out there, buy a backup tape, write to it one time, then break the read tab off and never, or the write tab off and never, ever, ever do it? Is that actually what you're going to do?
Yeah.
And yeah, your monthlies you might, and your annuals you do, and so on and so forth. But
I don't
very
know.
few organizations have the storage ability, even if they have the finances to
Yep.
make that happen.
And the discipline. It takes, let's say you have everything you need to do that. Is your IT organization disciplined enough? Do they have the operational maturity to actually do it? Right?
And it's easy to hand the directive down.
Yep.
And then somebody's like, you know what? I restore like 3,000 emails a week because somebody accidentally deletes something.
Yeah.
And or whatever. I have seen the please restore this accidental thing. Those queues are long.
Yeah.
And so dictating that this is this huge path that we're going to take to restore something, no, it's
Yeah.
not going to last because it's not sustainable.
Right. Yep. So that's the first one that always comes up. And then, I start going down this rabbit hole with I've had this conversation a lot on the conference show floor at a lot of conferences when we have a booth, right?
Mhm.
The next area people always go to is like, well, you know what? I'm going to set up an air gap, right? And for those listeners that may not be familiar with what an air gap is, right? Basically, I'm creating a separation of some sort between the offsite backup location and maybe my production environment, right? And I've seen this done via couple of different ways, right? I've seen some people, they'll set up a storage location somewhere and literally it's just the backup storage and they separate it via some sort of network isolation, or I've even seen people go to the level of having a scheduled task initiate a VPN connection 5 minutes before the backups run, wait for some sort of service call to happen that says, hey, the backups are done, and then it initiates another script that disconnects the VPN, right?
Mhm.
But and you and I used to disagree on this, Eric. As I correct me if I'm wrong, you've always been kind of against the idea of air gaps. Younger Andy was like, I could see air gaps working, but as I've gotten more into cybersecurity over the last 2-3 years now, it's like I'm not convinced an air gap is ever truly an air gap, right? Because ultimately, that VPN is going to be connected for a period of time if you're going that route, or um, I'm an IT team, I have to manage the stuff behind that air gap, right? So I, I see it happen all the times. Like, well, I got to manage that Linux server over there, and it's just easier for us to poke port 22 open, right? And now port 22 is open. And oh, hey, I'm not going to rely on a pesky username and password. I'm going to use an SSH key, and I'm going to store it over here in this really secret location. Well, it's funny how those locations have a habit of being sniffed out by threat actors, right? No, hey, here's this SSH key, and now that air gap means nothing, right? Um,
It's not an area.
3389.
Literally not an area.
Right,
And that is
exactly.
the part that I have been trying to plant my flag on forever. If there is even one tiny thread of access, it's not air gapped.
Right,
Period.
right.
But the real thing that I have been hanging on forever is, hey, I've been around long enough to remember when organizations weren't connected to anything. You think we didn't have compromises back then?
Oh yeah.
We were compromised.
Yep.
Not nearly as often. I mean, obviously, the internet made it easier for the threat actors to come in, but they still came in.
Yep.
You
Still.
know, so sitting there thinking, well, I believe that I have this broken for the internet, except for this ingress for Windows updates or something. There's always something.
Right. And
There's always something.
that's the point, right? Is there's always an entry point in some way, shape, or form. The other form of the other strategy along these lines that I've seen people argue as an air gap is I have a dedicated storage network, right? So in this case, they have like a SAN and they're using iSCSI or something to, and sure, the storage traffic is isolated, and a lot of times, Eric, you and I are old Hyper-V guys. I mean, that was like best practice, right? To have a dedicated iSCSI storage network, right? And so a lot of people look at that and be like, well, that's isolated, right? The backup traffic is only ever on the storage network. Well, what else is that storage network connected to? Your switches, your hypervisors. If your switches and or your hypervisors become compromised in any way, shape, or form, like that nifty storage network doesn't matter anymore.
And the other part, and I know that you and I talked about this in other contexts, and I'm going to probably say it every time on every podcast until we die, that when they come, they're coming for your authentication
Yeah.
points. That's where they're coming. And
Yep.
so when I hit your box, I hopefully, as a threat actor, have got your credentials. So that machine that is connected to the backup network on one side and the management network on the other, it doesn't matter that they you have no direct connect. You've got this bridge I'm logged into that can talk to both. I got you.
Yep.
And if you're sitting here like, I got these networks separated and you're dancing around, you're happy, happy, happy. Oh, okay, good for you.
Yep.
I got your admin password.
And see, that's the thing is like, I see the argument made all the time where like, oh, they'll never get a hold of my admin password. It'll never happen. It happens. It
It
happens all
does
the
happen.
time.
It does happen because the as much as they try, the authentication component itself is almost always has some fragility in it.
Yep.
I mean, and I could pick on a couple of vendors, but I will say I have spent too many nights in the last 6 months patching authentication where somebody sends something and all of a sudden they've got remote control powers.
Yep.
They don't need my actual password. That's not the point.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
Microsoft, as you know, is moving us toward a passwordless. They have started the initiative, and a lot of people are picking up on it. Passwords are passe. So again, that is not the point. The point is they're trying to break your authentication. They're going to pretend to be you, whether you can
Yep.
do everything you're supposed to do,
Yep.
and that doesn't mean they can't pretend to be you.
I mean, you mentioned Microsoft. I'll call out and how the authentication mechanisms themselves are under attack. I'll use the Storm 0558 incident as an example. We've talked about that multiple times on the show. Our good friend Paul Schneckenberg and I have talked about that a couple of times on the show now. The fact is that, and I'll link the episode where Paul and I explain this whole attack, but essentially the threat actor in that case got a hold of a key that allowed them to forge their own authentication tokens into Azure, into the Microsoft Cloud services. So they didn't
Yes. So
have anybody's password. They just
you
made
don't
their
need
own
the
session
password.
tokens.
Exactly. So let's great. You protected your password. Yes, that is like, but that's like congratulating somebody for putting his pants on before he came to work. It's like this is just you. Congratulations, you accomplished the bare minimum,
Yep.
but your job is not complete.
Right. Right. Exactly. Right. So again, that's the whole air gapping discussion. Which then takes me into the next area that people are like, well, you know what? I'm going to make a dedicated service account. And typically, what I've seen people do is they get this dedicated service account in their on premises AD, right? And that service account is what the backup services run as, and only that service account has access to the storage location where the backups are stored, right? Which, don't get me wrong, it's a great configuration, right? I mean, really, arguably, this is how you probably should do it in a lot of cases. And again, we're going to keep coming back to this multi-layered approach of security. I mean, anything that you can put into place that's going to make it more difficult for the threat actor to achieve their goal is great. The point here is that a dedicated service account is not a perfect uh, fix all solution by itself for ransomware, right? Because we just got done talking about identity mechanisms being under attack, right? Threat actor is going to sniff out that service account pretty quickly. And my big problem with it is, again, if I'm worried about compromised admin accounts, that that protection for the backup storage itself only exists at like the share and folder level. It's not going to protect me if a threat actor takes an admin account, logs into a SAN or a Windows server, wherever that backup storage is hosted, and says delete LUN, right? And they delete or they delete the storage itself, right? It doesn't protect you at the storage level, just at the folder and the share level, right? Um,
And capitalize on that point too is like ransomware scares us as it
as
should.
it should.
But threat actors are not necessarily there to encrypt. Some of them are there for destruction purposes.
Yep.
I worked for you. You fired me. I'm mad that you fired me. Now I'm in your infrastructure and I have the delete key.
Yep. That's a good
Yeah,
point.
you have to think about things like that.
That's a good point. And I mean, it used to be things were like that were an outlier, right? I feel like they've
Mhm.
gotten more common in the last 10 years, stuff like that.
Either they're more common or we're hearing it more. I don't know which.
One of the two. And that's probably a whole
Um,
different episode, right? Having that discussion. So, well, then I've got two more items here. One of them is, again, not a magic silver bullet. And then our final point, actually, I really like, but we'll get to that. So, the next point that I see after all these things have been discussed, these conversations I have on this topic is okay, I'm going to do application whitelisting. So, only those executables that I allow to run in my environment are going to run, which, don't get me wrong, application whitelisting is fantastic. It's really good at what it does.
mhm.
There's some problems with it, though, when we talk about it in terms of protecting against ransomware. One I have found by experience in multiple organizations, it requires a lot of operational maturity to manage, especially at scale, right? So, I mean, anybody who's done it knows it is a
Yeah.
pain in the rear end to
Yeah.
manage.
It's interesting you bring up the subject of scale because I would say in larger organizations, it's easier as long as you can be realistic.
Right.
So, what you will see in a lot of places, and like we're talking about that healthcare institution, they have a lot of publicly accessible kiosks.
Right.
And those kiosks are turned down to, you can run what we say you can run,
Yep.
and that's it. And just so we're keeping up with the times, we're trying to move away from white and black listing to allow and block listing.
Right. That's true. That's very
So
true.
we
That's a
should
good point.
probably not. So we have an allow list out there, and these kiosks, that's all they can do, and they're very easy to manage at scale. However, they're kiosks, so only things that fall in that category get this kind of treatment. When we're talking about your regular end user workstation, you've got doctors, you've got nurses, you've got and it's easy to put them in one group, and they're not one group.
Right.
You know, your cardiologist and your oncologist are going to be doing different things, you're using different tools,
Yep.
you know, so on and so forth. And your nursing has so many levels. Like people who don't really know much about healthcare don't really get how nuanced the field of nursing is.
Right.
So, so I can't make two buckets, a doctor and a nurse bucket. That's not going to work. I can't. So many things about this are these stations that employees are going to use are too hard to singularly classify so that I can say, we're going to do this allow list on this machine.
Right.
And we're going to template that, and then we're going to make it accessible to 5,000 people. Almost zero chance that's going to work.
Right. Right. That's a good point. I mean, again, it's great at what it does, but it just it becomes difficult, right? And I also pair this with the fact that as an industry, we've seen an uptick in living off the land style attacks. And if people aren't familiar with those style of attacks, that means me as the threat actor, when I log into your environment, I am going to use as many of the built-in native tools inside the environment to conduct my attack. I'm going to use as many of those tools as possible with the goal of evading security software, right? So, for example, the one I always use as an example is PowerShell, right? PowerShell is going to be present in pretty much any environment. And using just PowerShell alone, I can cause an immense amount of destruction inside of an environment, right? I mean, I can encrypt, I can actually use PowerShell to create ransomware, right? I could do all of the encryption using just PowerShell, right? So when we talk about application whitelisting, right, is like, okay, are you going to prevent PowerShell from running on every endpoint? Probably not.
And we need to have a huge discussion about that. We really do, because, all right, let's do something. Let's have a little bit of fun. We're going to call this Explain a Technology Badly. Okay. So what is PowerShell? The answer is it is a command line interface for .NET.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And hopefully the PowerShell people are out there like, what it is.
Somebody's
I mean,
screaming at their car. Somebody's
you
screaming at their car radio right now.
Yes, they're beating on it. Oh, what are you doing? What are you doing? But that's what it is. And the reason I need to really knock this home is PowerShell doesn't give you the ability to do anything that you couldn't already do.
Right.
It really doesn't, because .NET doesn't give you the ability to do anything that you couldn't already do.
Right.
It just makes it a little bit easier to get to the things, but you already have the power.
Right.
So before, what they were doing is what you were saying, they're building executables that call into WMI, or they call into Windows APIs or
Yep.
whatever.
Yep.
But now they're calling this .NET exposed endpoint that calls the same API, or behind the scenes, it all gets to the same place.
Yep.
So if you turn off PowerShell, you didn't take the power away, you just made it a little bit harder.
Yep.
It's
Exactly.
all that you did. And somebody who's dedicated enough, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, you put a speed bump down for a few people, but what you also did, and this is the other part of the basic point of computing is to process, do things, get things done. That's why we have these devices.
Yep.
Right? So everything in security involves making it harder to do that.
Right.
Right? And this is what makes security so hard, is you literally are attacking at the very core of what a computer is to make it more secure. So by turning off PowerShell, you make the legitimate users' lives much harder and don't really impact the bad guys very much.
Yeah. And of course, that whole age-old discussion of security versus ease of use, right?
Yes, because it's always what it is. You're always taking
Yep.
away one to gain the other. That is what it's your entire game, and it's hard. It
Yep.
is tough.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, the last item here is I guess, newish in terms of backup storage. It's been around forever, but it's really seen an uptick in usage over the last couple of years for backup storage. And this is one of the probably the best item on this list in terms of ransomware anywhere, and that is immutable storage, right? And if folks are not familiar with what immutable storage gets its core findings in the concept of worm, right? Write once, read many, right? I'm going to write this block of data and it cannot be changed now, right? Not even God can change this block of data after it's been written, right? That's the whole purpose of immutable storage. And I I think it's especially important, we're talking about backup, is utilizing immutable storage in the cloud. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second, Eric. On-prem immutable storage versus cloud immutable storage. But what's nice about immutable storage is that I'm, as a backup provider, a backup application, I'm going to take my backups, I'm going to write the backup in an immutable fashion. And now it doesn't matter what comes around and tries to alter those blocks. They can't be altered, period. Right? Even an admin account cannot alter those blocks or change them, right? Because it's managed, you know, at the file system level, wherever that immutable storage is. And this is where I come into the conversation of cloud versus on-premise immutable. When we're talking about on-premise immutable, it's still great to use for backup storage, but you run into the same problems that we've kind of already talked about yet, right? Is that if the threat actor has access to the root storage device itself, maybe they could make some changes to that immutable storage. I mean, they're not going to be able to change it, but maybe they could just delete the LUN that was set as immutable, right? Or something along those lines. And this is where I really like the idea of having cloud immutable storage, right? So when I say cloud immutable storage, I'm thinking like S3 buckets, Azure storage accounts, Wasabi cloud storage, right? Um, I I know we've spent a lot of time on this show talking about the various security issues with Microsoft. Eric, I don't. You can probably correct me here if I'm wrong, but I don't think I have ever heard of like Azure's core infrastructure being compromised. Have you?
Not to my knowledge.
Like I know there's
No,
like we mentioned the Storm 0558 case earlier, right? Basically that was giving the threat actor access into customer tenants, right? But that was not the actual Azure infrastructure itself.
no, they're still going through that authentication keyhole
Yep.
and having to duck and dodge and wind their way through, and they never became Azure administrators.
Right. And so if I think about that, if I'm a threat actor and I want to try to get at some immutable storage that's hosted inside of Azure, like I have to get access to the Azure management plane, which, like I said, I've not heard of that happening. And then
No,
I have to just go through the arduous task of finding the target storage at that point, right? Because I mean, multiple data centers, millions of servers, right? And I
yeah,
mean,
they might. Let's not hang our hats too much on that. I mean, they luck strikes and patterns,
I
and
suppose true, right?
we're really in danger of stepping onto that security by obscurity thing that'll get people really pounding on their radios at you.
Fair enough. But I guess, if and again, you don't want to rely on a single technology. The whole point here
No,
is multi-layered. But I would say immutable storage is probably the strongest tool out of all the tools we've talked about today in terms of protecting your backups. So, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Eric, before we wrap up?
it gets the two biggest ones. It stops the delete and it stops the ransomware.
Yep.
You still have to be concerned about theft
Right.
because immutable is readable.
That's true. That's very
You
true.
know, and another part of it, I really like where you're going though, because the biggest thing is we have to understand that going back to what we were talking about earlier, where the computer has a job to do, unless you are literally altering the physical substance of something, it is mutable.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It's going to a magnetic disk somewhere or a solid
Yep.
state. The device is fundamentally writable at
Right.
any time, easily so, right? So your entire goal here is to ensure that the mechanisms that allow writing are realistically and practically out of hands of people that you
Yep.
don't want to be able to touch it. And yeah, every once in, and I don't even want to say every once in a while. I see a lot of times a lot of small companies kind of pushing forward this. Oh yeah, it's the cloud is just somebody else's computer. They're not making it any safer. You can do better in house, or we can do better for you. And I would really like to see the Azure security engineers reading those claims. Like, bring it.
Right.
Okay, are you really better than we are? And I assume if they're not Amazon or Google, I don't think they're really ready for that challenge.
Right.
So exactly what you were going to, the point that once it becomes immutable out there in that cloud bucket, as long as you have done your due diligence, you put your pants on, came to work, your passwords are secured, you've done everything you can. Well, you have minimized that down to the authentication points at Amazon or Microsoft or whoever your
Yep.
cloud provider is, and they are constantly being beat on, and they are constantly working on it. They have entire teams dedicated to nothing else except keeping that kind of stuff from happening, and they fail. But I still overall feel much more confident than I do in this little three-man shop over here who's trying to keep 80 customers afloat.
Right.
Honestly,
Yep. Very true. Very true. And again, pairing this with some of the other solutions we've talked about, you're just making it as difficult as possible for that threat actor. But yeah, that immutable storage, if I was going to go out and set up a business today and configure my backups, you could be for sure I would use immutable cloud storage in some way, shape, or form as part of that equation.
100%, 100%, not even a question.
Yep, for sure.
It's
So
like the only thing that would turn me off is like, well, our annual budget is $5. Like, not everything.
we'll see.
Something needs to be rethought here.
That's another part of it, right? Is, I mean, immutable cloud storage. I mean, at least for us, and maybe this is a little bit of a product plug, and for those folks, I try really hard to keep our product plugs to a minimum in this show, but if I put my administrator hat back on, I really love how we do immutable storage inside of our VM backup application, because when we write the backup storage to the immutable blocks in the cloud, we put basically a time counter on there, right? You as the administrator have the choice. How long do you want these backups to remain immutable? You can do a day, 14 days, 365 days, right? So it allows you to manage that cost while still getting the benefits of immutable storage, right? So if I select 14 days on day 15, that immutable block flips off, right? Completely outside of my control. It's completely managed on the back end, so I can't
Time
influence
locked
that.
safe.
What's that?
There's a time locked safe.
Yep, exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yep. So, anyway, if you guys are
It's still
interested,
making calls though, so we still have to. But for the ransomware and the delete protection, it is, yeah, that immutable cloud storage is just unsurpassing what it can do.
yep,
It really is.
for
There's
sure.
just nothing comparable besides literally like carving it in stone somewhere.
Right.
And if you can do that more cheaply than you can do your cloud-based storage, everybody wants to talk to you.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So, well, Eric, I think we're about out of time today. So it's always good talking to you, my friends. Having these conversations, and I'm sure I'll have you back on for future backup and security conversations.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Definitely. Glad having you. And folks, if you found value in today's episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button there, or we're available on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms. So again, thanks for spending some time with us today. We really enjoy doing the show for you guys. Hope you have a great day. Hope to see you again for a future episode. Stay safe out there. We'll talk to you later.